Welcome students. Today let us continue with our topic of bryophytes. Today we will be discussing about the distinguishing features of bryophytes from algae and pteridophytes. As we all know, the group Bryophyta is intermediate between the groups Thallophyta and Pteridophyta. The plant kingdom being divided into cryptogams and phanerogams. The cryptogams further are divided into Thallophyta, Bryophyta and Pteridophyta. Engler in 1886 suggested that all the plants above the level of Thallophyta be grouped into a subkingdom Ambrophyta. Ambrophyta is divided into the Bryophyta, which is the Atracheae, which is devoid of tracheates, and the Tracheae, which is having tracheates, the groups which are having conducting tissues from Pteridophyta onwards. Now, what are the distinguishing features of bryophytes with the two groups, that is the algae and the pteridophytes? Now, the group Bryophyta, since it is intermediate between the two groups algae and the pteridophytes, has some characteristics similar to them, and some of the characteristics are dissimilar to the groups algae and pteridophytes. So, what is the mode of life? The algae are mainly aquatic. On the other hand, the pteridophytes are terrestrial and the bryophytes being amphibians. Now, though the pteridophytes depend on water for the act of fertilization. The plant organization. The algae, except some marine forms, have a very simple internal and external structure, that is a thallus-like plant body. In bryophytes, there are two types of organizations, the thalloid and the leafy. In the leafy forms, the leaf and stem are simple without any vascular tissues and belonging to the gametophytic generation. In pteridophytes and other higher plants, on the other hand, the plant body is highly organized, being differentiated into roots, stems, and leaves, provided internally with xylem and phloem. The sex organs. The sex organs in algae are antheridia and euconia, and they are simple, mostly unicellular, but when they are multicellular, all the cells form gametes. The sex organs in bryophytes and pteridophytes are highly developed, known as antheridia and archegonia. That is, the male and female sex organs are multicellular structures with an axial row of cells surrounded by a sterile jacket. Alternation of generations. In algae, there is either no distinct morphological alternation of generations, and when it is present, it is mostly homomorphic. That is, the two generations, the gametophyte and the sporophyte, are morphologically similar, but the two generations are always independent to each other. In bryophytes and pteridophytes, there is always distinct morphological alternation of generations. The two generations are dissimilar, that is, they are heteromorphic. In bryophytes, the sporophyte is always dependent upon the gametophyte, and in pteridophytes, the sporophyte is parasitic on the gametophyte only in the initial stages of development. Gametophyte soon dies away after the sporophyte is capable of taking care of itself. Now, what are the distinction between the term Ambrophyta and Thallophyta? What are the characters which differentiate the Ambrophytes with the Thallophytes? In Ambrophyta, the gametophyte is always multicellular. In Thallophyta, on the other hand, it is either unicellular, bicellular, or multicellular. In Ambrophyta, the sex organs are multicellular with sterile jacket layer. In Thallophyta, normally the sex organs are unicellular If multicellular, all the cells are fertile. In Bryophyta, the egg is permanently retained inside the venter of archegonium, whereas in Thallophyta, normally it is retained and sometimes it is expelled out of the oogonium. The sexual reproduction is highly advanced in the members of the Bryophyta, which is oogamous, whereas in the members of Thallophyta, it varies from isogamous to oogamous. In Bryophyta, zygote always produces multicellular embryo instead of showing direct germination, whereas in Thallophyta, the zygote directly germinates into the new plant. The sporophyte is always dependent on the gametophyte either for time being or forever in Bryophyta, whereas in Thallophyta, except for the class Rhodophyceae, it is independent of the gametophyte. In Bryophyta, meiosis strictly occurs in spore mother cells, whereas in Thallophyta, meiosis takes place in the zygote or spore mother cells and very rarely in the gametangia. The life cycle always show an heteromorphic alternation of generations in Bryophyta, whereas in Thallophyta, the members show an isomorphic alternation of generations. Now, the distinguishing features between the two groups of Bryophyta, that is the Bryophyta and Pteridophyta. In Bryophyta, the gametophyte is predominating, whereas in Pteridophyta, the sporophyte is predominating. In Bryophyta, the sex organs are stalked and are raised on the thallus, whereas in Pteridophyta, the sex organs are sessile and are embedded in the prothelial tissue. In Bryophyta, the neck is relatively longer and has 4 or more neck canal cells, whereas in the members of Pteridophyta, the neck is short, usually contains 2 or 1 neck canal cell. Venter normally has its own jacket in Bryophyta, whereas in Pteridophyta, the venter is deprived of its own jacket. In Bryophyta, the androgonial cells are normally cubical, whereas in Pteridophyta, the androgonial cells are polygonal in shape. In the members of Bryophyta, the antherozoids are strictly biflagellate, whereas in Pteridophyta, the antherozoids may be multicellular, but rarely they are biflagellate. The embryo is protected by calyptra in Bryophyta, whereas in Pteridophyta it is protected by the adjoining prothelial tissue simply due to want of calyptra. Thus, calyptra is absent from the members of the Pteridophyta. The sporophyte is represented by the sporogonium in Bryophyta, which is fully or partially dependent on the gametophyte and it lacks the vascular tissues. In the members of Pteridophyta, the sporophyte is denoted by the original plant body, that is, it is differentiated into root, stem, and leaves. The sporophyte is independent of the gametophyte and it always bears the axial cylinder of vascular tissues. Meiospores are all alike in Bryophyta, whereas in Pteridophyta they are either alike or dimorphic as micro and megaspores. Bryophytes show an heteromorphic alternation of generations between haploid gametophyte and diploid sporophyte. That is, the gametophytic generation is the dominant one, whereas in Pteridophyta there is an alternation of generations between the diploid sporophyte and haploid gametophyte. This figure shows an life cycle pattern of the Bryophytes. The Bryophytes begin with the gametophytic plant body. When the plant body becomes mature, it bears sex organs in the form of male and female gametes, that is the antheridia and the archegonia. The antheridia produces the antherozoid and the archegonium produces the egg. The antherozoid fuses with the egg to form the zygote. The process of fertilization or syngamy marks the beginning of the sporophytic generation, that is the diploid generation. and the zygote further gives rise to the embryo, and the embryo gives rise to the sporogonium. The sporogonium in turn gives rise to the spore mother cells. So beginning from zygote to the spore mother cell, the plant body is diploid, that is the sporophytic generation. And the spore mother cell undergo meiosis to give rise to the spores, and the spores are again haploid and mark the beginning of the gametophytic generation. The spores directly germinate to form the bryophyte plant, or it may undergo an juvenile stage, the protonema, which gives rise to the bryophyte plant. So this is all about the alternation of generations in bryophytes. In our next lecture, we will be discussing the vegetative reproduction in bryophytes and the classification of bryophytes. That is all for now. Thank you.